Aibowan and welcome. Today marks the Earth Day 2023, the 53rd anniversary of Earth Day, and America Sri Lanka Photographic Arts Society Los Angeles is celebrating Earth Day 2023 at the Sri Lanka in Focus photographic exhibition being held at the Art Gallery of the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, on April 22nd through 23rd, promoting environmental conservation in the context of nature photography with a special focus on the grandeur of Sri Lanka's natural habitat. Our world needs transformational change, and it is time for us, the present generation, to hold ourselves accountable for our role in our environmental crisis, while also calling for bold, creative, and innovative solutions. Today's exhibition is designed to commemorate Earth Day 2023 and to support the worldwide efforts to conserve and revitalize the environment of the blue planet that is our home. If we are to succeed, we must listen to the children who will link hands from around the world and voice their concerns and ideas to preserve a pristine environment for their generation. With that in view, we have invited two young advocates to address the pressing issues of the environment of our times. Temi Pereira will address us from the University of California in Berkeley, and Tiara Ganegama from Colombo, Sri Lanka. Temi will speak on climate change, our ecosystem, and biodiversity, while Tiara will speak on climate change, our oceans, and marine resources. Now, let me introduce our first speaker today, Temi Pereira. Temi is an 18-year-old environmentalist and activist. She's a local leader for the Sunrise Movement and has appeared on the news for organizing several climate strikes. 2 years ago, she founded and has led a national workshop that hosts events and publishes a newsletter to teach kids to become activists. Temi is a passionate believer that anyone who can incorporate sustainability into their work and encourages everyone to become an activist for the environment. So with that, we welcome Amy. Amy, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for letting me speak today. My name is Temi, and I will be speaking on biodiversity, climate change, and ecosystems. So first, I want to talk about what biodiversity is. So biodiversity is short for biological diversity, and it is the variety of all living things and their interactions. Biodiversity is important in three types: genetic diversity, species diversity, and ecosystem diversity. Genetic diversity means that it is important to have a diversity of genes within a species. Species diversity means that there should be many different species interacting in an ecosystem, and ecosystem diversity is the amount of different habitats that there are in a given area. So, for example, on our Earth, we want to have as many different ecosystems as possible. So why is biodiversity so important? Biodiversity, you may have heard, it's a big buzzword in a lot of environmental communities. Biodiversity is important because it is the foundation of survival for ecosystems when they have a disturbance. For example, if an ecosystem goes through an event like a fire or a hurricane, that would be considered a disturbance. if there is a lot of different animals that live in the ecosystem and a lot of different genetic material, then there is a higher chance that some of those animals will survive to repopulate after the disturbance. So biodiversity is very important to think about when we're thinking about how climate change will interact with our world as we know it and will disrupt the ecosystems that we have. With that in mind, I want to move on to the topic of extinction and climate change. Extinction and climate change have long been linked, as there have been many mass extinctions throughout natural history. There are 5 big extinctions that many naturalists talk about that have existed all the way from 450 million years ago to a current extinction that is now being referred to as the Holocene extinction. Throughout time, we've seen that big climate change coincides with large mass extinctions because climate change impacts all of the community of ecosystems and will kill a large amount of animals that are not used to the climatic conditions when they're rapidly changing. Right now, in the Holocene extinction, we are already seeing impacts of climate change on the biodiversity of our ecosystems. As of 2021, 19% of species on the IUCN Red List of threatened species are already being impacted by climate change. And these are species that we would refer to as endangered species, species that are being protected already. So we know that it's having a drastic effect on these species that are already struggling. And as of the most recent IPCC 6th assessment report, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the foremost authority on climate change research that we have today, as of 2023, out of 4,000 species that were analyzed, half were seen to have shifted where they're located on the globe to higher latitudes to escape warming of climate change. So as we can see, animals are already coping with climate change by changing where they live. And this can show us the drastic effects that it is already having and show that we need to take action immediately. So what is the big deal with animals going extinct with climate change? Well, one concept that is important to think about is trophic cascade. Trophic cascade means that an animal's importance in an ecosystem can be widely outsized. My favorite story to tell to explain this concept is the story of wolves in Yellowstone National Park. Wolves in Yellowstone National Park were hunted through the area because of killing livestock, and so they were removed from Yellowstone National Park. When that happened, the deer that lived in the park overpopulated and ate many of the trees and plants, and because of that, there was not enough food left to support the amount of deer that were there. When wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park, it drove down deer populations, and scientists saw the health of the ecosystem drastically improve. So even though the wolves were one species, when they were removed, every single species was affected, and the ecosystem as a whole was much less healthy than before. So even though one animal or one species might not seem like such a big deal, we must remember that our ecosystems are interconnected. And so when we talk about species being lost to climate change, it is really important that we keep as much biodiversity as possible. So do we have any numbers on how climate change will impact species and what extinctions we project will happen? Yes. As of the last IPCC report, if we assume that the world will warm 3.2 degrees Celsius, which is considered a high emission scenario, 15% of invertebrates, 12% of amphibians, and 10% of flowering plants would be at very high risk of extinction. And 50% of insects, 45% of plants, and 26% of vertebrates would be at very high risk of extinction. So this is incredibly drastic numbers. If you can imagine the effect that just one vertebrate, the wolf, had on that ecosystem, think of that much of our world going extinct. On the contrary, if we look at the emission scenario for 1.5 degrees Celsius, 2 degrees Celsius, less than 3% of invertebrates, amphibians, and flowering plants would be at very high risk, and 18% of insects, 16% of plants, and 8% of invertebrates would be at high risk. As we can see, lowering our emission scenarios greatly reduces the amount of species that will be impacted. If we look at the Paris Climate Agreement, which projects 1.5 degrees of warming, then the impacts are even less than this. And so reducing our emission scenarios would greatly increase the amount of biodiversity and the amount of animals and plants that survive climate change. And so with that, I want to encourage everyone to, when we hear about biodiversity loss in the news, when we hear about climate change, it's important to remember just how drastic these effects can be. Everything is interconnected. And when we hear about bills going into Congress and the politics around climate change, it's important to remember to educate ourselves and with this knowledge, do our best to limit the amount of warming that will occur through climate change. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Temi. We really appreciate you taking the time and joining here today with us to provide us a wonderful presentation. It was very informative. So thank you so much. And I'm going to turn to our second speaker, Tiara Ganegama. So let me give a brief introduction about Tiara. Tiara will make a presentation on ocean and marine life. She's 16 and is a persevering young leader with a vast range of interests, from building 3D models on Mecha bricks to programming on Scratch MIT. Tiara is a tech geek, but also the ideal nature lover who is passionate about every nook and corner the natural world has to offer. Following up her undying interest in prehistoric life, Tiara published her very own children's story on dinosaurs at the age of 9. So she is a wonderful author as well, and her amazing writing skills cannot be disputed given her intense reading throughout the year. Watching science programs like How the Universe Works, Tiara spends her free time boosting her knowledge of the world. And with that, let me turn it over to Tiara.
a little bit of my personal story and how seeing the repercussions of climate change actually got me into ocean conservation. So I've grown up in Sri Lanka for the past 15 years of my life, and I've grown up by the ocean. Some of my fondest memories associated with my childhood are spending time down south of my island where I collected hermit crabs or watched life in the little rock pools or stared out and watched the sunset almost every single day. But it wasn't till much later on in my life that I actually got into scuba diving. And I was exposed to an entirely different world. And my biased opinion is I tell people that if you think forests are the prettiest things you've seen, wait till you dive underwater because it's an entirely different alien world of its own. And I've always loved diving. But along with seeing the beauty of the underwater, I've seen grave destruction, and it's really hurt me as someone who loves the ocean. So there was this one instance in my life that actually inspired me to um, inspired me to get into ocean conservation. I It was during the early part of my diving journey that I dived in a location in Trincomalee, which is in the east coast of Sri Lanka, and I did the same. I did a similar dive in the same location 6 months later, and I've been doing so. I've been doing the same periodically. And I've seen over just a few months, I've seen a tremendous loss of biodiversity in the area. And you're looking at destruction of the coral habitats, you're seeing coral bleaching, and you're seeing the environment decline at a rapid rate. And I'm thinking to myself, if I'm seeing such visible change over just a period of a few months, imagine what's going to happen in a few years. You might not even have these coral habitats. And that really, it struck me because I realized if you look at it, for the past 19 years of my life, I'm seeing visible change in the environment around me and the surroundings that I've grown up with. And I realized that it's important if I don't take a stand right now, if I don't do everything within my capacity to try and protect the place I love, I'm going to regret it 10, 15 years down the line when I can't show it to my children or enjoy it with my family. And 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 that's what really got me into ocean conservation because I realized that action is needed right now, and you need young people involved in ocean conservation taking a stand within their communities. So that's why I got into ocean conservation, and I've done the small scale of work that I've done thus far. So if you look at the importance of our ocean, it makes up actually 70% of our planet. So if you're a diver, you have far more areas to explore on our planet. And the importance of our ocean, not only is it important to contain the type of biodiversity that it has, but it's important for us humans because it helps mitigate extreme weather conditions. It also generates the oxygen we breathe. So in addition to trees, the ocean also contributes to generating oxygen. It also produces the food we eat. So if you like your fish and your seafood, then obviously the ocean is the source for it. And it also stores the excess carbon we generate, and it plays a fundamental role in mitigating climate change because it serves as a major heat and carbon sink. But although the ocean acts as this huge carbon sink, it also has to bear the brunt of climate change. So if you look at the statistics, since the Industrial Revolution, the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere has increased by over 35%, primarily from burning fossil fuels. And the ocean water, as well as the ocean, the habitats, the corals, all contribute to actually absorbing this increase of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. So the oceans have absorbed more than 90% of global warming created by humans since 1970. So that's a huge number that the ocean has actually absorbed. And did you know that if the ocean didn't absorb this 90% of global warming, then our temperatures, our global average temperature would have actually jumped up by 56 degrees Celsius or 100 degrees Fahrenheit, making Earth almost unlivable for us humans. So because the ocean is this huge carbon sink, it has been able to control the levels of global warming. But there's obviously a limit to anything, and this limit has exceeded. And now we're seeing detrimental impacts of climate change on our ocean, which is extremely sad. So I've identified today 5 main impacts of climate change on our ocean, and I want to briefly touch upon these 5 impacts. So the first impact I've identified is that the minute you have the ocean act as its carbon sink and absorb all the global warming and all the carbon dioxide, it actually increases the water temperature, which is bad for fish as well as for us humans. So there's a phenomenon that is called coral bleaching. What happens, so how coral bleaching actually happens is corals are extremely sensitive habitats, right? So the minute you have this minor change in temperature, that's when these corals get extremely stressed and they try to exert the algae pigmentations that they have within them, right? And that's what exposes this white skeleton of theirs and makes them almost transparent like. This doesn't mean that the coral is dead, but it increases the risk of starvation and disease. So eventually the coral does result in dying. We're seeing mass coral bleaching taking place in all along the Great Barrier Reef, and also when I dive in Sri Lanka, I'm able to witness certain areas have coral bleaching take place. So this is happening, like I told you earlier, I've been diving the same locations for over a period of 2 years, and I see that every time I dive, 6 months apart or a few months apart, I'm able to witness new patches of coral bleaching. So it's actively taking place in Sri Lankan waters right now. So it's extremely bad because you're going to have more dead zones, more corals dying, which are going to impact reef fish that actively benefit and thrive off these coral habitats. Another issue with the water getting warm is that it threatens to cause mass migration of marine species because they can no longer live in these extremely warm waters. So they go in search of finding right conditions to feed and reproduce. So they end up migrating from their natural habitats to colder regions. So, for example, you see the conservation international research has revealed that the ocean warming has altered the habitats of tuna, causing them to move significantly to the east of the Pacific Islands. So, this mass migration could cause catastrophic impacts for economies in the Pacific Islands, such as Fiji and Cook Islands, that actively benefit off of these tuna. So now they no longer have the ability to fish tuna because they've moved to different regions. So end of the day, this increase in water temperatures come back and hurt us humans as well. And this change in water temperatures also affect the development of a lot of marine species and growth, which can cause catastrophic declines in their populations. So I want to show a small video of, as you can see, the white areas are signs of coral bleaching. So this coral is in the process of bleaching, and this coral is something that I recorded during one of my dives in Trincomalee in Sri Lanka. So the second major impact of climate change on our ocean is polar ice melting. So the Arctic sea ice continues to dip to new lows as the ocean warms, as well as Antarctica is shrinking underwater as submerged ice is rapidly melting, according to the recent studies and statistics. So this causes detrimental impact to species such as polar bears or seals or penguins that actively live on these in these polar regions where they're seeing a loss of their habitats, so therefore we're finding a decline of their species. But also these polar regions are important for the production of algae, and this is the foundation of the Arctic food web actually. So and this algae, the presence of this algae depends on the presence of this ice. So the minute the ice diminishes, that's when you're going to have the algae also diminish, and this causes a ripple effect because species such as cod and seals in the Arctic or whales actively use this type of algae as a part of their food chain or their food web, so they're no longer able to access this algae, so we're finding a decline of their species as well. Another critical habitat that is affected by ice melting is the Antarctic krill, which is a main food source for a lot of seabirds and mammals and whales. So the minute the Arctic krill populations drop, you're going to find a decline of species that actually feed on these Arctic krill as well, which is extremely detrimental. So you're seeing a massive loss of biodiversity caused by the melting of ice in the polar regions. The third impact that I've identified that actually mainly affects us humans is the rising sea levels due to the ice caps melting in the polar regions. So the minute you have polar ice melting, it actively rises the sea levels. So according to statistics, 1/8 of an inch per year is the rate that the sea levels are rising. So obviously it's pretty straightforward. You're going to have cities being affected, coastal cities that are going to be affected by the rising sea levels, because these sea levels are going to come in and take up land, right? So you're going to have a loss of habitat for us humans as well. So recent research actually reveals that major cities such as Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, or Shanghai, China, Mumbai, India, and even smaller islands like Maldives and potentially coastal areas in Sri Lanka could be affected by the rising sea levels. The fourth impact I've identified is the warming oceans alter currents, right? Why is this important, and how does this affect biodiversity and wildlife? Because most often than not, a lot of these marine species migratory patterns depend on how these currents flow in our ocean, right? So the minute these currents are altered, so would these species have to alter their migratory patterns. And if you look at a lot of these species actually depend on these currents and temperature to reproduce and actively obtain nutrients, right? So, for example, reef building coral and reef fish species heavily rely on these currents for the dispersal of their larvae, right? So, the moment these currents alter, that's when it's going to impact their it's going to impact the natural way of how they reproduce, where you're going to see a decline of these species that actively benefit off of these currents that are no longer going to be present due to or changed due to global warming. So you're going to have drastic impacts on the lives of these species, and end of the day, it also would affect us humans. Another impact of climate change is affecting the chemistry of the seawater. The moment you have these fossil fuels, the burning of fossil fuels, it increase greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, also chemically alters the composition of seawater the minute the ocean acts as a carbon sink and actively absorbs all of these gases. Because the minute the ocean absorbs all these these greenhouse gases, it makes the ocean more acidic. So this phenomenon is called ocean acidification. So what results from ocean acidification is that this level of acidity actively dissolves calcium carbonate shells. So this affects a lot of species that has shells such as corals, scallops, lobsters, crabs, microscopic plankton, and also turtles, where their shells are going to dissolve over a period. So as you can see in this picture, this shell over a period of 45 days has dissolved due to the type of acidity that's going to be present in our ocean. So this is going to, the increased acidification is going to limit the ability for certain fish to detect predators, and this disrupts the entire marine food chain. And this is going to hurt most of the shellfish species as well, shell forming organisms as well. So those are the 5 main impacts that I've identified. But obviously, if you look at climate change and the impacts it has on our oceans, I don't think I can talk and I can highlight every single thing because it's massive. If you look at the repercussions of climate change causes ripple effects, so it ends up hurting a lot of habitats that actively that are in the coastal ecosystem. But those are the main impacts that I think were crucial for me to highlight today. So I think it's important for us to know the harm and what we can do to stop or help in the fight to combat climate change. And I think the reason why people are complacent right now is because that you think a lot is out of your control. As youngsters, it's easy for us to feel like, oh, climate change, global warming are global issues. What can I, being such a small individual, do to actively help or stop something that is extremely large scale? And that's when it's important for us to note that yes, change has to come from top, where you have governments pushing for policies, for regulations, pushing for regulations where companies have to minimize their emissions or take actions or steps to reduce climate change and um, their impact on global warming. Like, yeah, it does have to come on top, but we can push for change as well in our little capacity. So I think the first thing and the first step we could take is to speak up. As youngsters, we could always go out there. We can talk to adults and we can tell them, we can speak up for our future. We can tell them that we need the type of policies passed. We need the type of regulations in place to stop further damage because you're hurting our future. We're not going to be able to show our kids the type of biodiversity that we witnessed growing up where we want to live in a world free of emissions, free of global warming and climate change. So it's important for us to speak up and lobby governments to try push policies that actively help the environment. So you can do this by joining climate strikes in your neighborhood, or just simply educating your peers around you, your family members on climate change and what they can do in their capacity to actively reduce their contribution to climate change. So I think if each individual changes their lifestyles and makes a marginal um, a marginal impact on this fight for climate change. If you look at it in numbers, if each individual does it, if each family does it, collectively, we can create a greater change. So I think that's something that I want everyone to take home with them throughout this presentation. And another thing you can do is you can power your homes with renewable energy, switch to energy efficient appliances, so thereby you're not going to use things like coal and gas that are extremely harmful and actively contribute to global warming. Also, cutting down on water wastage is important because it takes a lot of energy to pump water, to actively clean water for us to consume. So if the minute you cut down on water wastage, you cut down on your consumption. Therefore, there won't be much of a demand for for them to actually use this and contribute to global warming. Then also, if you eat the food that you buy and compost what you can, then because a lot of emission takes place when you transport these food to your village or your community. So you have to, if you can consume what you buy, but also compost what you can. So therefore, you won't be sending your garbage into landfills that create methane gases that actively contribute to global warming. You're going to be making change. Also rethinking taking planes or automobiles if you're a frequent traveler in these modes of transports. Know that air transportation actively emits a lot and contributes to global warming on a great scale. So you can rethink your transportation methods and opt for more eco-friendly transportation methods. For example, if you're traveling a close distance, you can use your bicycle. So these are easy alternatives that you can switch to. But also it's important to reduce, reuse, and recycle. So if you do this within your household, you're going to send less garbage out into landfills. So there's going to be less generation of these harmful gases that actively go into our atmosphere. So those are little things that you can do within your households to actually create a difference. And even if it's a difference, even if it's a small difference, I think it's your act that matters. And like I said earlier, if each person makes a small difference, if each family makes a small difference, then if you take it in numbers, you can create a bigger difference. And so I think as a youth, it's important for us to always push our community to take steps, and we can create a lot of impact. So thank you for listening to the presentation, and I hope you all gained something out of it. I think as the youth, we have the biggest role because it's our future we're talking about. So if we can educate ourselves, educate the people around us, I think we're on the right track to combat climate change, and it's going to be possible. So thank you so much, and I hope you all have a great day.
Well, thank you so much for joining with us today. And I also want to thank our two speakers today, Tammy and Tiara, for their wonderful presentations. Two very bright young advocates who've been instrumental in leading these conversations in their communities. So thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you soon. Have a wonderful day. Bye.